I was 86 years old when my son arrived with the papers I was never supposed to sign. He came through the front door of the house I'd owned for 38 years, the same door he'd gone through as a boy, the same porch where I used to sit and watch him ride his bicycle up and down the block until the streetlights came on. And he looked at me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Behind him, a younger man in a charcoal suit, leather briefcase, gaze settled somewhere between my face and the wall. A lawyer. Daniel didn't bother with introductions. He just said, "Dad, you just need to sign a few things. It's straightforward." As if I were a file to be closed. As if I were a loose end between two more important appointments. That evening, after they left, I sat in the armchair by the window, the same chair where Eleanor used to read on Sunday afternoons, kept in the same spot for 11 years because I hadn't known how to change things after she was gone, and stared at the floor without turning on the television. I felt something I didn't have a name for. Not anger, not grief. A kind of interior stillness, like the moment a clock stops in a room and only then, in the sudden quiet, do you realize how much you'd been relying on its sound. I think that was the moment I understood something was wrong, not just with the documents, with everything I thought I knew. 43 years I worked in accounting. I reviewed contracts that others signed without reading. I found discrepancies in figures my colleagues had passed over without a second glance. I learned, and this is something no classroom teaches you directly, that what is hidden always leaves a trace. Always. You only need to know where to look and have the patience to keep looking. That patience was the only thing I'd carried intact out of all those years. Everything else, the title, the salary, the recognition, the plaques they give you when you've outlasted everyone else's expectations, all of it faded. The patience stayed. If you're watching this from somewhere far away, from a quiet apartment, a house that feels too large, alone or with someone you love, please subscribe. This story isn't only mine. Tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes it matters simply to know that someone else has sat in this kind of silence, in this kind of chair, with these kinds of thoughts. My house in Millfield is a pale yellow colonial I've owned since 1985, the year Daniel started 3rd grade, the year Eleanor planted the rose bushes along the back fence that are still there, older than most of the neighborhood's trees. After Eleanor died, Daniel called every week, then every 2 weeks, and once a month. Then just at Thanksgiving and Christmas, those calls already short, his voice turning toward wherever he needed to be before we'd finished saying goodbye. I never blamed him for it. I told myself he was busy, that he had his company, his developments, his own pressures that I couldn't fully see from where I sat. His wife, Christine, had never warmed to me, but I'd made peace with that the way you make peace with a persistent ache. You acknowledge it, you don't pretend it isn't there, and you learn to move around it. I maintained the house. I kept up the yard the best I could. I spoke to the roses Eleanor had planted, and I waited, without quite admitting to myself what I was waiting for. When they came with the documents, Daniel said it was to streamline things, that it would give me fewer responsibilities, that it would protect me if anything happened. The lawyer placed pages in front of me one at a time, pointing to signature lines without offering me time to read. I asked, "What does this section actually say?" Daniel said, "It's standard language, Dad, nothing out of the ordinary." The lawyer shifted his briefcase. No one answered my question. I said I needed more time to look things over. Daniel's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from the time he was 14, and I'd caught him in something he thought he'd gotten away with. Christine, who was waiting in the car, I found out later, had texted him. I watched him glance at his phone. Something was moving slower than they'd planned. The next week they brought the same papers, and the week after. Each visit carried more urgency, less patience dressed as concern. Daniel said things that sounded like love but felt like pressure. "Dad, we worry about you. Dad, this is for your security. Dad, you don't want the courts involved if something happens and nothing's been arranged." That last one wasn't a warning. It was a map, showing me exactly what he intended to use if I kept refusing. I began noticing things I couldn't dismiss. I asked my bank to email my statements. Claire had shown me how, and found account inquiries from an address that wasn't mine, dated 8 days before Daniel's first visit. I took out a ledger notebook and started writing everything down. Dates and times. What was said, as close to verbatim as I could manage. What was avoided. The differences between the first and second versions of the documents, because they weren't identical. And in legal documents, small differences in language are the whole story. An accountant doesn't unlearn how to read the details. Then I called Margaret. Margaret Calloway had worked 2 floors above me at the same firm for 11 years before she moved into legal consultancy and, eventually, a quiet retirement in the same county. We'd stayed in touch, cards at Christmas, calls when something mattered, lunch once or twice a year at a diner on Route 40, where we didn't have to explain who we used to be. I called her on a Tuesday morning and said I had something I needed another pair of eyes on. She didn't ask what. She said, "Come Thursday, 10 o'clock. We sat in her kitchen, which smelled like coffee and old woodwork. I showed her the photocopies I'd managed to make while Daniel stepped outside to take a call. Margaret read them without speaking, moving through each page with the slow attention of someone who has spent decades learning to see what papers try not to say. When she looked up, there was no pity, just a clean, practiced seriousness. She said, "Walter, these documents transfer ownership of your home and a substantial portion of your savings to Daniel's name. You'd retain a life estate, the right to live in the house until you die, but you would no longer be the owner, and a life estate can be challenged." I didn't need her to go further. I was already thinking through what that meant. A life estate, while I lived. And then, if Daniel arranged assisted living, arguing I could no longer manage alone, if he and Christine divorced and the property became entangled in that, if my health declined and I could no longer defend even the limited rights I'd been left. My mind worked the way it always had when the numbers revealed something uncomfortable, quietly, methodically, without feeling anything until the calculation was finished. The feelings came later, in the night, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom I'd slept in for 38 years, trying to understand how a man can raise a child, give up years he can never recover, and find himself, at 86, reduced to a line item in someone else's financial strategy. I asked Margaret what my options were. The question felt humble even to me, but there was no time for pride. She walked me through the steps. First, sign nothing, regardless of the pressure. Second, establish my own legal protections while I was still fully capable. Over the next several weeks, with her guidance and a trusted estate attorney, we created an irrevocable trust and updated my property records with provisions preventing any transfer without documented, witnessed consent. It required appointments, reviews, and signatures across 3 separate visits. But when it was done, it held. and Daniel could not undo it without my agreement, which I was no longer prepared to give. While Margaret worked through the paperwork, I continued playing the father who was still considering. Daniel came twice more. Christine accompanied him on the second visit, sitting on the edge of the sofa with her phone in hand, her attention available for about as long as politeness required. I offered coffee. I spoke slowly. "I hear you, Daniel. You know, I've always needed to read things carefully before signing. It's just how I was trained." He breathed through his nose with a control that kept fraying at the edges. I wrote everything down when they left. "Let me ask you something, those of you watching now, wherever you are. What would you have done in my place? If your own child came with documents they wouldn't explain, speaking about care while the papers said something else entirely, would you have signed, out of love or fatigue, or the fear of being more alone than you already were? Would you have confronted them openly and risked losing even the thin thread of connection that remained? Or would you have waited and watched, quietly and carefully, until you had something solid enough to stand on? On a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the first visit, Daniel called and said he was coming with the final version, and that he needed my signature. "Today, Dad, we really can't keep pushing this back." His voice was different from anything I'd heard before. Flatter, more direct, stripped of the warmth he usually kept layered over the pressure like insulation over something that would otherwise be too cold to touch. I said, "Of course, come by whenever works." I called Margaret as soon as we hung up. My old friend Harold Saunders, who had been my witness at my wedding and who still came over on Friday afternoons to play chess because we had both decided years ago that it was worth the drive, agreed to be there. He only asked, "What time?" Daniel arrived at 1 in the afternoon with the same lawyer from the first evening. He didn't seem surprised to see Harold, just acknowledged him with a nod and began arranging the documents on the dining room table with the practiced efficiency of someone who has run through this moment many times in his head. He started explaining, in a tone that had been smoothed by repetition into something that no longer had edges. Then I opened my folder. Inside were the photocopies of everything Margaret and I had reviewed, the notes on the account inquiries with their dates, copies of the first and second versions of the documents Daniel had brought, annotated with the differences I'd identified, and at the top, folded once, the recorded deed amendment and trust documentation, stamped and registered, with a file number that could be verified by any county clerk's office in less than 10 minutes. I said quietly, "Daniel, these transfer documents can't proceed. The property and the accounts are protected through instruments that have already been recorded. Any change would require my documented consent, independently witnessed. If you have questions about the specifics, the attorney who handled the filings would be happy to explain them." No raised voice, no accusation, no performance. Just the voice of an 86-year-old man who had spent 43 years learning that the truth doesn't need volume to be the truth. The lawyer picked up the documentation. He read the first page. He turned to the second. He ran his thumb across the county recorder's stamp. Then he looked at Daniel in a way that required no translation. Daniel looked at me. The expression on his face was one I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, and I'd caught him in something he'd assumed he'd managed to conceal. Not anger, not defiance, but the particular kind of shock that arrives when an entire strategy collapses on a detail that wasn't accounted for. Christine, who had been waiting in the car, Harold told me afterward, had texted Daniel 3 times during the previous 15 minutes. He hadn't responded to any of them. They left without anything being signed. The lawyer packed the documents into his briefcase with a deliberateness that had nothing easy in it. Daniel didn't say goodbye. He didn't look at me on his way out. The door closed and the house held a kind of silence that was different from the ordinary silence I had grown used to in the years since Eleanor. Not the silence of absence, but the silence after a storm is past and the air smells different, and the light comes in at a slightly different angle, and everything is somehow more itself than it was before. I didn't cry that night, or the night after. I sat in the armchair by the window and I thought. I thought about the man who had painted those shutters in 2009. About Eleanor choosing this chair in a furniture store on a Saturday afternoon in 1997, running her hand along the armrest and saying it felt right. About Daniel learning to ride his bicycle on this street, falling and getting up, falling again, until one afternoon he made it halfway down the block without wobbling and looked back at me with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and triumph. All of it was real. The pain was real, a pain I didn't ask to resolve or explain or move past too quickly. But the steadiness was also real. For the first time in months, perhaps in years, I did not feel helpless. I did not feel erased. In the weeks that followed, Daniel did not call. He sent no messages, made no contact through any intermediary. Margaret explained that there were potential legal implications attached to what he had attempted, but that any decision about pursuing them was entirely and solely mine. I told her I would think about it. I'm still thinking about it some mornings, sitting by that window with the first cup of coffee of the day. Love doesn't dissolve because someone has betrayed you. It hurts, but it doesn't dissolve. And it's better to live honestly inside that contradiction than to pretend it isn't there. There is something you learn over the years, and you can't always say where you learned it. You learn that love and trust are not the same thing. You can love someone completely and simultaneously be unable to entrust them with a signature. Those two realities can exist side by side without either canceling the other. I love Daniel the way a father loves a son, with something that doesn't fit inside any word the language has managed to invent. And I also know what he did and why, and with whose help. Both of those things live in me together, quiet and heavy, the way two neighbors who don't get along still share a wall and have no choice but to find a way to exist. The house is still here. Every morning I make coffee and sit by the window that looks out on Eleanor's rose bushes. Every April they come back. Daniel used to call them Grandma's roses when he was small, before Eleanor was a grandmother. He just knew they were hers, and that was what he called them. They come back every year without asking whose name is on the deed, without waiting for permission or a signature from anyone. I see Claire every week. She knows the whole story because she asked, directly and without softening the question, "Grandpa, will you tell me what's going on?" She's a young woman with her own life ahead of her, full of things I won't be there for, but she sits with me without impatience and listens without reaching for a conclusion before I've finished. Sometimes she asks how I'm doing. I always tell her, "I'm all right, Claire." It isn't a lie. It isn't reassurance. It's a choice about how to regard what remains. Margaret asked me once, near the end of one of our working sessions, why I'd waited so long to call her, why I'd let several weeks pass before reaching out. I told her I hadn't been certain, that a person never wants to be right when he suspects his own child, that there's always a part of you holding on to the hope that it's your old mind seeing shadows where there aren't any. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Walter, The doubt that protects you is not the same thing as the doubt that diminishes you. Learning to tell the difference, that's the work. I've carried that with me ever since. It settled somewhere between my ribs and has stayed there, quiet and useful and exactly where I need it. 86 years old. The body is slower than it has ever been. My hands are unsteady in the morning before they warm up. The coffee cools faster than I'd like. Steps that used to cost me nothing cost me something now. But there is something else. Something I didn't have in my 40s or my 50s or any of the years when I thought strength was something you measured in what you could carry, that I have now. I know who I am. I know what I'm defending. I know that this right doesn't expire with age, that it doesn't weaken with solitude, that it doesn't yield to the pressure of people who love you and simultaneously do not respect you enough. And that knowledge, quiet, costly, earned through difficult weeks and cold nights and an afternoon in a county office signing documents that stood between me and someone else's plan, cannot be taken from me. Not by any document with another man's finger pointing to the line where I'm supposed to sign. Not by any sentence spoken quickly in the hallway of a house that once smelled like childhood and the woman I loved and the seasons that no longer return with the same face but still return. Not by any name written on a paper that should never have been written. I'll leave you with a question, and I'd like you to sit with it. Is dignity something that can be taken from us? Or is it the one thing we can only ever surrender ourselves? Think about it, and you know where I'll be if you decide to answer.